because, as you can see in the middle picture, I did a lot of service learning when I was an undergrad, including a trip to Haiti right after the 2010 earthquake as part of disaster relief. My service learning experiences were really bound up in this liberal white savior mentality, and I learned a lot from them, and I continue learning from them as I reflect on them and research them years later. But I'm not sure they were worth it because I worry that we didn't really meet community identified needs. So now, in addition to researching service learning, I also teach using community engaged assignments like you can see in the last picture. So I'm curious, have you ever been involved with a really great service learning partnership that just went off the rails? Maybe you're a faculty member who realized mid-semester that what students were learning from your course just didn't line up with your teaching objectives. Or maybe you're a community partner who found that your needs were not being adequately met by the partnership. Today, I'm going to be looking at some great service learning courses and partnerships. These are programs that root themselves in best practices, including meaningful service, student engagement, a focus on diversity and justice, student orientation and training, and reflection. They do everything right in terms of best practices for high quality community service learning partnerships. And yet, despite that, the service learning assignment ends up somehow being miseducative, perpetuating what Paperson calls the violence of mercy. I'll give you an example. This is from a Poverty in America course that I was involved in. The students learn to prepare taxes and serve as VITA tax preparers for Alabama families earning less than $50,000 or less. The students are learning about the structural conditions of poverty and its individual effects. It's a strong community service learning partnership with reciprocal benefits. For the students, they learn how to talk to strangers, work in a professional setting, prepare tax returns, something they didn't know how to do before they came to college for the most part. And for our community, in 2018, 76 UA students prepared taxes for nearly 7,000 families. Those families claimed nearly $10 million in refunds and saved more than $2.8 million in commercial tax preparation fees. So a few years ago, I was working with the course while I was in graduate school, and I was doing a research project on how service affects students' sense of place in their community. And I interviewed this student that I'll call Amy. Amy had amazing things to say about her experience in the course. She talked about coming to understand that people in poverty were incredibly hardworking, kind, generous people. She told me stories about the taxpayers that she'd met that stuck with her, the multiple jobs they'd worked to make ends meet, their concerns about living paycheck to paycheck, their drive so that their children could have a better life. Her interview aligned with the others that I had done with her peers in the course. It seemed to reinforce the power of service learning for shaping students' understandings of justice. But then we started talking about growing up in Alabama. Amy said that in her hometown, most poor people were Black, lazy, and happy to let the government pay for things that they really could get themselves. Keep in mind, we're talking about the home of the Montgomery bus boycott, the Birmingham children's marches, the attack on the Freedom Riders at the Anniston bus depot, and Bloody Sunday. It's the home of Letter from a Birmingham Jail and 4 little girls getting ready for Sunday school. It's the birthplace of civil rights because it's got such deep roots in white supremacy. I hate to admit it, but I froze. It should have been a moment where my role as teacher superseded my role as researcher. But I was 24. It was my first real research project. I trusted in best practices, let the student reflect on her experiences, make the service meaningful to students, set them up to be successful, and everything will click. My dependency on those best practices meant that Amy had a good understanding of the structural conditions of poverty. Yet this knowledge didn't prompt any critical engagement of her racist ideas. So what went wrong? The course did a better job of meeting community identified needs than student learning outcomes. I put too much emphasis on the best practice of reflection. without recognizing that reflection can be miseducative. The reflective cycle represents the hyphen joining service and learning. If the two are split, then the power of service learning falls by the wayside. So reflection, it's a risky business. When confronted with knowledge of poverty that was outside of her experience, Amy's reflective activity resulted in a cognitive seizing and freezing, or a refusal of ambiguity that encourages the mind to seek and settle on a single explanation for all new ideas. By asking students to reflect explicitly on their interactions with the taxpayers, we inadvertently encouraged a binary logic, a binary split in logic about poverty that allowed for a particular narrative to circulate wherein the taxpayers she met were fundamentally different, were valued differently from the poor people and people of color in her hometown. This happened because our course objectives didn't directly line up with community identified needs. By this, I mean that our focus on poverty wasn't intersectional. The course didn't explicitly deal with race. Amy had prepared taxes for Black people, of course, but somehow the focus on VITA taxpayers, who are by definition the working poor, allowed for this binary division between the deserving, unsung heroes she met at the tax sites, the bus drivers, the nurses, the lunch ladies, and the undeserving and mostly Black poor of her white supremacist imaginary. I think it's important to say that this is a course I really believe in. It's a great service learning opportunity for our students, and it's a valuable resource for our community. It's a course that I went on later to teach, but it too often happens that our student learning outcomes and our community identified needs don't line up. Unfortunately, this usually means that harm is done to the community served, whether indirectly as in Amy's takeaway that reinforced her racist logic, or in a very direct way. It's an easy mistake to make. I'm curious, share in the chat. Have you had an experience like this in a service learning course? What did you do? What would you have done if you were me talking to Amy?
Just a quick note, I'm not sure if the chat is shared between breakout rooms or not. I can, because when you go into the chat, it seems like it's the whole before we set up into different rooms.
It should just be ours.
We're a pretty small group too, so if anyone wanted to just share verbally, that would also be fine.
So I can go. I'm Julia Yakovich. I'm from UConn. So what would I have done and what would I have said to Amy? You know, honestly, I probably would have been stuck like you. Sometimes students reflect on things and it takes a while for us to process. So maybe I wouldn't have said anything in that particular moment. But you know, there's always an opportunity to follow up with the students afterward and have a really engaging conversation. But I agree with you, and it's such an important piece of this work of service learning. I struggle with it quite a bit, especially with being very intentional about linking up the social justice objectives within service learning frameworks. Because you can, as the service learning director, I can't be at every course all the time. And I can't ensure that X, Y, and Z is happening. So I appreciate the way you've laid this out. And I don't necessarily have a comment, but that's my comment and general reflection on that. So I appreciate you saying all of that.
Yeah, and even as a faculty member in a course that you're teaching, depending on what the service learning assignment is, it's quite possible that you might have students at different locations at what time, or that you might have several hours to choose from. It's not a given that you're going to be at the site all of the time to be able to really intervene in critical incidents like that. So
Yeah,
to an extent, we have to prepare our students, but it's hard.
It is, and so I'm currently working on establishing a relatively new, completely different infrastructure for service learning. Not a different one, but something that's more supportive, that takes me as like the main person a little bit out of the way, but I'm not sure how to do that. So that's going to take a little time, and hopefully some friends, some help from colleagues like you all, and I see a bunch of people from UConn here too. So I'm excited about that. Thanks.
That is exciting. Does anybody else have an experience like that? Okay, then we'll go ahead and get started again. Okay, so now I'll give you another example. This is a great example from a service learning collective that I really admire and learn a lot from, the Haiti Compact. They follow very strict best practices to make sure that their students are learning in a very intentional way while also meeting community identified needs. This is a really important, specifically because they're engaging students in short-term international service learning, which comes with its own unique complications. So this is a service learning course concerned with maternal health and nutrition. In advance of their time in Haiti, the college students researched and prepared curricula concerning maternal health for rural Haitian women, including nutrition during pregnancy, birth, and breastfeeding. Specifically, they looked at the moringa tree. And moringa trees provide critical nutrients to pregnant and nursing mothers, and they've been called the mother's best friend. So the students' assignment was to move to different Haitian communities to teach pregnant and nursing mothers how to best care for their health and the health of their babies while making use of newly planted moringa trees. However, the students soon learned that all of their research and their plans had been for naught. One student reflected, the community partner explained that the mothers hadn't taken good care of the moringa trees given to them, which was why the goats could easily destroy them. We realized we should have reiterated that information even more so that they could be convinced to take better care of their trees. The community partner went on to explain that a lot of the information we had prepared was already well known in the community and had been conveyed to the locals by Haitian healthcare workers. There's so much going on here, right? There's the fact that there are goats involved, so it's quite foreign to these college students. There is their diligent research about subject matter that they're learning about. And then there's also the miscommunication with the community partner. So the service learning team concluded, we could help by reiterating that information in order to build up the locals' confidence in their health workers' knowledge, thus building a better relationship of trust. However, this experience, it undermines the assumption that training in skills and content knowledge is a best practice for that sets students up for success in service learning. The students knew best practices for maternal health and nutrition. But as a new mom myself who's currently nursing, I can tell you that even just the pills that have the moringa extract in them taste awful. I cannot take them. They make me nauseous. In other words, the students didn't and couldn't know the local context. They couldn't know the context of their community partner or the context of these nursing moms. Best practices couldn't prepare them for that. While the students likely learned from the experience of realizing that the community held more knowledge via lived experience about a matter that they had trained for, the same service provided by a local community partner rather than that group of students would have had a stronger impact on the community served. So, what went wrong? This time we see that the course met student learning outcomes, but failed to meet community identified needs. Again, this is a group that I admire that's very intentional about the ways that they implement service learning. But the fact is that the students often possess the wrong types of expertise necessary to realize learning in community. Many of our students come into their service learning experience with expertise in whiteness, privilege, capitalism, comfort, globalization, and neoliberalism. Of course, I'm generalizing here. But these knowledges that they come to the class with, that they come to the community service assignment with, they interfere with learning in community. There's definitely student learning happening here. The question that I have is, what cost? I'd like you to take a minute to think through whether service learning experiences that meet either student learning outcomes or community identified needs are worth the risks. Share your reactions, and you can put it in the chat or you can just unmute yourself.
I was going to say, would it be beneficial to have a kind of like a training? So, they get the student outcomes and they get the training in the classroom, and then they have the, community people there, but maybe having like some sort of a, communication or like training sessions prior to actually going and doing the service project. Because I think if there's a combination of communication going on between the two groups, that might help to create some more knowledge for the students who are participating in the service learning activity to be able to kind of come in with that knowledge right when they start, so that maybe that transition becomes a little bit easier when they're actually doing that.
Yeah, so possibly having not only the students are learning subject matter, but also some very intentional training on engaging and working with the community partner. Someone else said in the chat, I don't think it's worth the risk. The community partner members are always the ones that lose when it's harmful. Scary. Anyone else? Okay. So at first glance, service can be understood as a merciful response to community problems. Yet the service response that falls back on best practices rather than authentically engaging with the individual context of student learning and community identified needs perpetuates what Law Paperson calls the violence of mercy. For Paperson, mercy is another way of understanding Paulo Freire's false generosity. In his article, The Postcolonial Ghetto, Paperson draws upon William Shakespeare's comedy, The Merchant of Venice, to suggest that charity distributed out of mercy represents a violent enterprise. Paperson argues that mercy often offers a veneer for plunder, which is employed to separate and exclude. Service learning assignments that allow student learning that accidentally reifies white supremacy or fails to meet community identified needs are just two examples of the ways that service learning can be a ruse of goodness, relief, and self-determination for communities without truly responding to those community concerns. From this vantage, we might see mercy as a facade of helping grace, which allows community problems to continue unchecked while the students in the university congratulate themselves on their goodness and their benevolence. I argue that best practices have a limited function when dealing with living beings. Service learning has been swept up in a neoliberal push toward evidence-based practice and what works pedagogies. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. Part of it comes from this assumption that we need scientific rigor to thrive and assert ourselves in the academy. And best practices can be valuable. But when the goal is standardization and replication, so that community partners and students can be assured of set and tested benefits, and learning goals can be replicated for each service learning course. Yet best practices offer a false hope in that they're efforts to structure the complexity of living beings and communities. There's nothing random or replicable about learning in community. Though service learning can produce powerful student and community results, these results are nested in the context of community partnerships, reflection, and reciprocity. When our use of best practices glosses over the unique ways that your students learn or the particular needs of communities, we risk perpetuating that violence and mercy. I hope that my examples underscore the importance that we as faculty and community partners have to reflect on our partnerships and our commitment to community engagement. We cannot simply expect students to do the work. We must be vigilant in critically reflecting and assessing our partnerships and our student learning goals. If our partnerships aren't the very best way to meet student learning outcomes and community identified needs, then I think they're simply not worth doing. Frankly, as a faculty member, there are easier pedagogies to use. So what are examples of service learning partnerships that do this work well? I'll talk about two briefly. So here, students in a healthcare sociology and a pre-med course partner with a vision care initiative. They take pictures of the eyes of children in preschools, daycares, and Head Start programs across Alabama. The cameras can detect vision problems that children can't self-diagnose. Children don't know that the reason that they can't tell B from D when they're learning their letters is because they have a vision problem. They think there's just something wrong with them. They're not as smart as the rest of their classmates. And sometimes these vision problems would even lead to blindness. The cameras detect all of that. So the college students get a hands-on experience with patient care, and they're guided through readings, class discussions, and reflective exercises in understanding the sociocultural landscape that binds healthcare with education and poverty. And for the 10% of Alabama's children that learn of vision problems through this screening, we have free follow-up care that's provided through a community partner. In a poor state like Alabama, this is life-changing for some of our kids. Another great example where student learning outcomes and community identified needs line up really well is a structural engineering course here. We had an awful tornado a decade ago that devastated many of our communities and quite a lot of our off-campus student housing. We lost 53 lives that day. The experience fundamentally transformed our campus and community relations. One good that came out of that, though, was a structural engineering course that now partners with our local Habitat chapter. The students in the course needed to learn how to develop building plans that would withstand different types of crises, earthquakes, fires, tornadoes. Previously, they did this as a hypothetical assignment. It was part of their final exam. The professor realized, though, that his students possessed expert knowledge in a community identified need. So now, rather than that hypothetical project, the students work on real building plans for the Habitat houses here. Everything's reviewed by the professor, of course. But this is an example of service learning at its best. Service learning that makes learning meaningful for students. and is life-giving for our community. So I'm curious, do you have any examples that you've tried that work really well that help resist that violence of mercy?
Hi everyone, my name is Mary Duggan. I'm at medical school, Rowan University in Southern New Jersey. I think I'm in a bit of a unique opportunity here compared with a lot of people who do this work because I teach a service learning course. So much of what I get to do is
Mary, I think you may have cut out. The last that I heard was so much of what I get to do.
Sorry about that. I have an unstable internet connection, so sorry if I cut out. But so much of what we do is having these conversations, not shying away from them, and naming it, and having students critically analyze, their own implicit biases, and taking a step back and thinking about what they're bringing into the communities that they're serving and how they are similar and different from those communities, and just, putting it out there, naming it, right, and not shying away from the conversation.
Megan, I have a question about the class that you were just talking about.
Yeah.
You said it was a structural engineering class that partnered with Habitat for Humanity, which I think that sounds like a good idea as far as like the topic of the class and the community partner that they chose, and like how they're able to hopefully do service in a way that's actually what it's supposed to be, which is a learning opportunity for students, not pretending that we're giving a resource to the community that they don't need. My question though is, like, did they get any cultural competency in that class? Did they get, I think it's still missing that sort of like, yeah, but do they actually know what's going on in that community? Do they know why Habitat for Humanity exists? I feel like it doesn't really do the trick if we don't. Anyway, I guess the question is, did they get any of that? Do you know?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in that particular class, no, that was a structural engineering class that was an indirect service project. The students knew that they were they knew that what they were doing was for Habitat. I believe the Habitat partner came and spoke to them mid-semester, but they weren't actually doing any sort of direct service that would help prompt those kinds of conversations you're talking about. We are currently working on a new program that this course would be part of, that would be a specialty track for engineering students that are interested in DEI and social justice stuff. And so that curriculum, they would then have more of those kinds of conversations, but in its original iteration, no, that is certainly something that would be a room for growth.
Cool. Yeah, because I think it's great. I like that you all are finding ways to do service learning that doesn't involve the community members. They don't really need us to be in their communities. We can still do work on their behalf. But I wonder if students walked away from that still having those preconceived notions, or like thinking a certain way about folks who are engaged in that service, because they didn't get a chance to integrate. But like I said, I'm excited to see that you guys are maybe integrating that in the future.
Yeah, I think that that's entirely possible. My perspective, so before I was a faculty member, I was the assistant director of our service learning center. And so my perspective is that I like to an extent, meet the faculty where they are, and their willingness to engage community pedagogies. So if they have an opportunity that's going to line up with those community identified needs and their student learning outcomes, that's fine with me. For that particular course, the student learning outcome was that the students learned how to build a structurally safe building. So I think to an extent, pushing the faculty to shift their student learning outcomes in some of our content heavy courses, you might get some pushback from the faculty, and and maybe less willingness for their students to be involved in those kinds of pedagogies.
Megan, may I jump in here? Again, Julia Yakovich from UConn. So I do a lot of the facilitation between community partner and faculty member, and I hear you loud and clear about meeting faculty where they are. And my role, we used to have an Office of Public Engagement where my job was really to be in the community and identify these community needs that I then lined up to courses that we offer. That switched. We unfortunately closed the Office of Public Engagement. But within my role, I really learned to pull in service learning courses in a collective impact model. So it's like I became the backbone for a lot of these projects. So one of them was rehabilitating an old antique clock, which is in the north end of Hartford, which is within a promise zone in this city. And so maybe you're familiar that it's federally designated promise zones are technically the lowest socioeconomic, lowest education outcomes in the nation. And so I try to wrap projects around, that project is still ongoing. And so I pull in landscape architecture, I pull in so that we can design the park around the clock. And I get involved with real estate and commercial real estate because we're also looking to get a grocery store in that neighborhood. And so there's all these things that come up. And so I can't do this all the classes, obviously, but there are specific projects that come out of my office that I'm able to have those conversations with faculty, and they actually allow me to come in and kind of take the reflection part of their course and talk about the social justice aspects of it. And as I mentioned before, that's not the answer to a large university, but that's one way I do it. It looks like we're running out of time, so we might be closing up.
Yeah, I mean, I think that capacity is certainly, oh golly, I think we are. Nick, is it going to kick us out?
Yeah, we still have 50 seconds. So you can answer the question.
So I think capacity is definitely a problem. And I think part of what I go back to is that, any individual course is just one piece of a student's curriculum. And so if it's meeting the student learning